Welcome to the Catholic Culture Podcast, dedicated to the Holy Family. I'm Thomas V. Mirus. Today, Phil Lawler, Jeff Mirus, and I are talking about our favorite books that we read in 2018. Hey everyone, today is the 25th episode of the Catholic Culture Podcast, so thank you very much to everyone who has tuned in. I'm very pleased to have reached this mark, and I'm hoping to have another great year next year. Let me apologize for the delay since the last episode. I was going to put this out a week or two ago, but I had a different guest that I was going to do, and that guest had to reschedule multiple times, and we probably won't record until a little bit later and put that episode out in early January. So for the 25th episode, I got Phil and Jeff together last minute, and we did this instead. Last year, we put out a list of our favorite books that we read in 2017 as an article on CatholicCulture.org, and that also included some music and film suggestions from me. And I decided to do the same list again, but also to do a podcast episode where we could discuss things more informally and extensively. So we talk about most of our book selections from the list. We don't talk about everything on the list. And there's some films and music and podcasts that I recommend on the list that we don't talk about in this episode. So I recommend checking that out as well. And the link to that list will be at CatholicCulture.org/episode 25. But before we get to that discussion, there's something else I wanted to mention. There is a lot going on at the Metropolitan Museum of Art right now for people who are in New York City or in that area or coming from now to mid-January. There's a really interesting exhibit on Armenian Christianity. For those who don't know, Armenia was the first nation to become Christian as an entire nation. Unfortunately, they were heretics. They were Monophysites, although I don't know if they were that from the start. But they have this whole exhibit on artifacts from Armenia. And there's quite a number of unique religious art forms that they developed, one of which are these khachkars, I think they're called. They're like these cross stones. They were initially used for graves, but then for all sorts of different things. And that's unique to Armenia. And then there's another thing where they have on top of all sorts of different types of buildings, they have these miniature models of churches. So on top of like a secular building, you're going to have this tiny little miniature church. And the art style, they didn't have icons. They venerated gospel books rather than venerating icons. So they have this whole tradition of gospel books. And the art style is like, it bears some similarities to Byzantine art, but it's almost more Asian looking. And there's a lot of interesting things. Like there's two different depictions of a bishop in this exhibit, of the same bishop. And one of them, his vestment has a fleur-de-lis all over it because of these trade routes that Armenia had going all over the place. And then on the other one, his vestment has a Chinese dragon. So it just shows you how much of the rest of the world Armenia was in contact with at that time. And then the other interesting thing was that they had some of the first printed gospel books in this exhibit. The thing I noticed about that is as soon as they started having mass production, the art instantly became Western. Like all the printed books were using engravings that this Dutch guy made. And suddenly it's this completely different, they like totally ditched their Armenian artistic tradition, which somehow is not surprising. But I'd be interested to see if in other countries where they have these long-standing artistic traditions, but then this printing technology came, if the aesthetic of it somehow became Western. Okay, so why don't we start talking about our books that we read this year, or the ones that particularly stayed with us. Phil, why don't you start with your first pick?
Okay, well, I confine myself to books that came out this year, which eliminates a whole lot of the books that I read. And the first one is, I deliberately took books that are not in my regular wheelhouse about Catholic affairs, or at least most of them. The first book on my list is Mr. Meehan's Mildly Amusing Mythical Mammals. And I will confess that I have a personal relationship to the illustrator, John Foley, who is my son-in-law. But it's a fascinating book. It's a children's book, but it's not really a children's book. That is, it's the sort of book that you read to your children, but you get a good deal out of it yourself. And Matt Meehan, who's the author, is a great believer in poetry, and it's a series of poems about mythical mammals. I find it fascinating. I think it's an answer to a problem that we have in our society, that we don't encounter good poetry very much. I'm not saying it's great poetry, it's good poetry, but in order to develop your taste for great poetry, you have to be acquainted with good poetry. And this is good poetry. It's fun. You learn from it. There are a lot of allusions, classical allusions, which make it a challenge for an adult. And as I say, I think this is the sort of thing, if you have little children, you should read it to them, and they will get something out of it, but you'll get something out of it too.
That sounds great. What you were saying about good poems being an introduction to great poems, that sounds like a John Senior kind of idea. I haven't read John Senior, but I know he had this idea of the 1,000 good books to prepare you for reading the smaller list of great books.
Right. Well, as a matter of fact, I was reminded, I heard Amy Fahey give a presentation at Thomas More College just a few weeks ago about Joyce Kilmer. And she was making the point that when Joyce Kilmer was in his heyday, he was not a great poet. He knew he wasn't a great poet, but he was a very good poet. But what was remarkable is that his poems would appear in places like the New York Times, or, newspapers, daily newspapers would have poetry. You don't have that anymore. If you encounter poetry these days, it's probably an advertising jingle, and it's probably really awful.
Right.
Yeah, except in First Things, right?
First Things is an exception, yeah.
Yes.
I mean, there are a few highbrow magazines that carry poems, but
right.
The ordinary person in ordinary life just doesn't meet up with poetry, and that's too bad. I mean, we're coming to the Christmas season when everybody is singing Christmas carols, which are poems set to music mostly.
Yes.
And you love them.
Did your animal,
that's a great point.
Excuse me. Did your animal book, Phil, have any relationship to Belloc, the Bad Child's Book of Beasts, or any roots there?
I'm sure inspiration.
Okay.
Well, it's going back to this medieval bestiary tradition, isn't it? Kind of?
Sort of, yeah. You'll find a lot of... Matt Meehan, the author, he's a very literate guy, and you'll find lots of allusions. Some of them not so obvious, some of them pretty obvious.
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess in newspapers and magazines in the mainstream used to have poems published in them as a matter of course. Many poets who now are relegated to the literature classes would have had their poems published in mainstream publications.
Exactly.
Yeah, the past year I've been getting this journal Modern Age, which I believe was founded by Russell Kirk several decades ago. And right now it's edited by Daniel McCarthy, who was also an editor at large for the American Conservative. They publish maybe 3 or 4 poems per issue. It's a quarterly. And they're often pretty good. They had a couple of poems by Samuel Hazo, who is a former poet laureate, I forget of what state, in there that were good. And I've read a few things that I liked in there. I haven't read much of the First Things poetry. Okay, so Jeff, what about your first pick?
Well, I'll go heavy, and I mean this literally as well as figuratively, because I'm about 3/4 of the way through Elio Guerriero's new definitive biography of Benedict XVI. It's called Benedict XVI, His Life and Thought, and it's just out in October. From Ignatius Press. It reminds me a lot of George Weigel's definitive biography of Pope John Paul II. This isn't quite as long. It's a 706-page hardback. Guerriero is very good, not only at following the trajectory of Joseph Ratzinger's life from the period right before his birth through the present, really. But he's particularly good at explaining the theological ideas that Ratzinger and then Benedict was working with as he tried to respond to all the challenges that he met, first in pastoral work, because he was primarily a theologian, first in pastoral work, though, and then later as head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, and finally as Pope. The book is really very good at showing the progress of his thought on a whole variety of important issues, from the person of Christ to liberation theology. It is a long book, as I said. It's challenging reading, but because it's so good on the theology, there are unifying elements to it. And we can even see some of the false starts that Ratzinger made in some of his ideas that he would later reject and go in a different direction. And also, it's clear in the book how Ratzinger distinguished himself and separated himself from a relatively early time from people who were going in a modernist direction. He was an ally of older men like von Balthasar and de Lubac and Congar at the council and thereafter. And he had eventually had to distance himself, substantially from people like Karl Rahner and especially Hans King. So there's a lot there. It's really a history of the kind of intellectual challenges of the post-war world. And in that sense, it's fascinating. I would highly recommend it to anybody who's got the stick-to-itiveness to go through a biography that is that long.
All right, so my first, I'm going to double up here because I think I have a lot more on my list than you, and I don't want to be sort of stuck just listing a bunch of things by myself at the end. My first two books, they're both fantasy works. The first is probably something that I'm late on to the game on because I know a lot of people consider this a classic, but I only heard of it recently. It's a book called The Last Unicorn by Peter Beagle, published a few decades ago. This is an extremely weird book. It is something of a fairy tale. It draws on a lot of traditional fairy tale elements, but the author, I think the thing that struck me the most is, first of all, the writing is really beautiful. Secondly, the author achieves these like whiplash-inducing tonal shifts where sometimes it's this really high, almost mystical fairy tale stuff, and then you come upon a bunch of bandits in the woods eating tacos. There's just sort of this strange satirical, or not satirical, but parodic kind of element to it as well. So it's like this weird thing where you're like moved and then you're laughing and it's kind of ridiculous, but somehow it all fits together in the same book. I'm not sure how he managed to pull that off. The second is I read all of the Narnia books for the first time this year. Now, I know you read them to me, Dad, when I was a kid, but I had never read them since then, and I didn't remember them that well. So I read all 7 of them, and so I'll just say my favorite was The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. I think that's a lot of people's favorites. I found that my 2 favorite characters in the Narnia series are Reepicheep and then from the Silver Chair, Puddleglum.
Oh, absolutely.
Do you, Phil and Dad, do you have a favorite of the Narnia series?
I'm not sure.
That's a tough one.
I'm not sure I remember it well enough, the individual books well enough, but the comical character of Puddleglum, I think, stands out, and Reepicheep too, stand out in everybody's mind. Reepicheep the mouse, pulling his sword and ready to battle to the death anyone who impugns his honor or the honor of Aslan. And Puddleglum, who's always got a negative comment on every situation, such as, "It'll probably rain for days, I shouldn't wonder."
What about you, Phil?
I might lean toward The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, but I'm not sure. I love them all. I reread them often with grandchildren, having run out of children to read to. And And then I look forward to reading the space trilogy, or rereading it every so often, particularly what's the third book of the space trilogy?
That Hideous Strength.
That Hideous Strength, which I often wonder if it's really a fiction, because he absolutely nails so much.
Well, I know your wife refers to it a lot.
Exactly. Yeah. And there are characters in that I can see. I have met some of the characters in that book.
Right. And I would say, out of all the works of fiction by Lewis that I've read, that is the best as a novel. I think that conceptually that I like Perelandra the best of the space trilogy. I mean, there's some things that I like in that Hideous Strength, and other things that, like with Merlin, I'm not really sure what he's doing, and it's slightly weird. But that is just so, it's the most novelistic of those books, and he's got all these characters, and all their sort of little petty motivations are very well portrayed. Whereas in Out of the Silent Planet and Perelandra, the main character is alone most of the time, so it's really just you're getting his thoughts.
Right.
The other fiction work by Lewis that I've had multiple people tell me is far and away his best and most mature novel is Till We Have Faces. Have you read that?
Absolutely.
This is an interesting discussion, especially the space trilogy, because while I agree that Lewis was spot on in Till We Have Faces, to me, it was the weakest of the trilogy, because I didn't regard
it. That wasn't. Did you mean That Hideous Strength?
I mean That Hideous Strength. Yes, thank you.
Okay.
To me, it was the weakest of the trilogy because I didn't think it was effective fantasy. In other words, I really thought it was a different genre than the other two. So
I think that's pretty much right.
So for me, Perelandra was, I thought, the richest and the one. The fantasy that delivered the more powerful Christian message.
So, Phil, you think that Till We Have Faces is his best novel?
I do. That's one I need to reread.
Yeah, I'll really have to read that, because I've had a couple people tell me that it's far and away his best. It's like he's a different author,
right?
Or not a different author, but operating on a higher level.
It's not as easy to read as the others. It's a more serious work.
Now, Tolkien was not a big fan of That Hideous Strength. He was really enthusiastic about the first two books of the space trilogy, certainly comparatively to his opinion on Narnia as well. But part of the reason he didn't like That Hideous Strength was, I think, the influence of Charles Williams, who he liked very much as a person, but he didn't really like his influence on Lewis. And you can see that in some of the more sort of occult type themes, which were very big in Charles Williams's thought and in his novels, at least based on the one that I've read. I think I read War in Heaven. Have you read any of his stuff?
I haven't.
I've read a couple of his novels, although I can't remember which titles anymore because it was a long time ago. But they are definitely bound up in the occult, and I found them fairly disturbing and did not like them well enough to continue it through the whole series.
I want to say there might have been one of them that Tolkien did like, and I forget which one it was. I think it was called The Place of the Lion. In any case, there was one where the novel was about the Platonic forms emerging into England and taking over the things of which they were the forms, which sounds like a great concept for a novel.
It does, yes.
So I'd like to check that one out at some point. Now, do you two have any thoughts on Lewis versus Tolkien in terms of their fiction output?
Phil?
They're different.
Yeah, go first.
They're different. I wouldn't want to try to keep score. I love them both. It's apples and oranges.
Yeah,
fair enough.
Yeah, they are very different. In some ways, Tolkien, I think, is even more successful than Lewis in creating a whole different world, and I guess the reason I say that is because in Tolkien, I think, in a completely different setting and with largely different creatures, you find the same things kind of imperfectly understood in play that are really in play in real life, even though there is for the sake of the story, there's a there's perhaps a more easily identifiable specific material goal to destroy the ring. But in Lewis's fantasy, while it's fabulously entertaining, I mean, it's clear that he's articulating a Christian argument. And that, in a sense, makes it less like a real world unto itself, I think, than for Tolkien, who's much more complex.
I did earlier in this podcast series, I think about 12 or 13 episodes ago, I did 2 episodes with a Tolkien scholar named Corey Olson. And in the first one, we discussed Lewis and Tolkien. And I think what he said is that he's come to the conclusion that the difference between them is that Lewis is fundamentally a teacher. They're both teachers and they're both artists, but Lewis is fundamentally a teacher. That's what he would choose if he had to choose between the two. And Tolkien is fundamentally an artist. And I was also talking about this to one of the guys I share an apartment with, who's a Lewis scholar, and he related an anecdote about Lewis and Dorothy Sayers, where Dorothy Sayers had written something. I think it was a book on maybe the 7 deadly sins or something like that, and Lewis had asked her if she would write an essay or another book on this topic, basically maybe to popularize it for people, and she really did not want to do this, and she said, like, I've already said what I was inspired to say on this topic, and I feel like it would be false of me to write another book on it when I don't have anything new to say. And she described it as like a matter of artistic integrity, even though she was talking about a work of nonfiction. And Lewis just could not understand this, and he kind of disparaged this and thought she was being pretentious. And she got very offended, and finally he had to apologize and just accept that she wasn't going to write this popular version of something she had already written because she didn't feel like she had anything new to say. So she didn't feel it would be like authentic of her to write another book on the topic.
Interesting.
That is interesting. I do think that Tolkien is an artist in a way that Lewis isn't. I don't think that, well, put it this way, The Lord of the Rings is a great literary work. And I don't think you would say that about the fiction of Lewis. It's wonderful stuff, but I wouldn't put it up there as one of the great literary works of the 20th century.
I think that's fair.
So, okay, we've done our cycle here, yes. So, Phil, why don't you do your next pick?
Okay, another thing that's out of my regular wheelhouse, but very much in my consciousness these days, is Life After Google by George Gilder. Gilder is an old friend, and you may remember him from back in the days in the Reagan administration when he wrote Wealth and Poverty, which was a massive bestseller. And he's written about feminism, he's written about economics, and then he made the move into the high-tech world, and for the last 20 years or more, he has been really at the cutting edge of internet development. Life After Google is an extended argument about the future of the internet. His complaint is that it's controlled from the top down, largely by Google and Facebook and Amazon. And this isn't the way the internet was supposed to be. It's like all of George Gilder's books, this is a bit of a rant, and it's a bit disorganized, and he flies all over the place, spinning off ideas and telling you stories. It's a fascinating read. A lot of it is over my head, but when he comes down saying that we're about to see a new development, a new way of doing the internet, which will make Google and Facebook obsolete. It will use blockchain technology. But the important thing is that it will make the internet experience controlled by the user rather than by these big providers. And that's something that I think has to happen, because we have two problems. One problem is all the data breach problems, that the security. And the other problem is that if Facebook and Twitter and these, Snapchat and so forth, if they're controlling 80% of what goes on in cyberspace, they have enormous power to control conversations. And controlling conversations is the opposite of what the internet was supposed to do. So it's a fascinating book.
Yeah, that sounds great. I need to look into the issue of Amazon.com in particular, because I've been sort of feeling increasingly uneasy about it. So I need to really do some research and sort of decide where I come down on that. But yeah, that sounds good. Earlier this year, and I forget the publication, but the philosopher Alan Jacobs, who I think is Catholic, wrote an essay about why all kids should be taught to do basic coding, basically so we can take control of the internet as a creative space back from these big companies, like basically back from social media. Basically, what the core of his argument was that social media needs to be, in theory, YouTube or Facebook could shut down tomorrow, and all of your content as a content creator would be gone, and you would have no recourse. What he basically says is that social media is great for putting your tendrils out there, but it should not be where your content lives. It should not be your home base. So you need to learn to create your own website that is independent of that stuff, where your content lives, and use social media as a way to put it out there. But a lot of people are just creating their content, however, much or little value it may have, on social media directly, whether it's YouTube or Facebook or whatever. And that is a dangerous thing to be dependent on.
Absolutely. And this seems to me the real promise of blockchain technology. It's not so much the currencies like Bitcoin. That to me is an epiphenomenon. The really important thing is to make you the owner of your own material and have you control who has access to that material. And it, I gather, is now relatively easy to do. And it's a question of who is going to be the first to break through and provide a new way of using the internet. It may be this new browser, Brave. Apparently, Brave is being built with this goal in mind. And I'm looking forward to it because the power of Facebook is very dangerous.
Dad,
by the way,
you must have some thoughts on that.
Well, I have a thought on Alan Jacobs. Unless he's converted since since I first read a book of his essays about 10 or 15 years ago, he is not Catholic, but you might want to check that.
Okay, well, he probably isn't, but I think I just assumed he was because I remembered you reading something by him and writing about it years ago.
He's a great essayist.
I'm sure you must have some thoughts on this, though, Dad, since you've been doing this for so long.
Yeah, on the whole internet thing. It's the blockchain has some very interesting potential universal applications, which would really revolutionize security, as Phil mentioned. One of the problems that we have whenever anything gets widespread in culture as a whole is that the superficialities that dominate the culture will dominate the media. And I don't know that the internet could ever go back to be dominated by major players and still be nearly as useful as we find it as a matter of routine. But the danger of, as Phil just pointed out in one of his very recent commentaries on CatholicCulture.org, the danger of the increasingly secularized leaders of major tech companies, in effect preempting even traditional, national notions of rights and liberties in order to make sure that anything that they consider hate speech, for example, would be barred from exposure. That danger is very real.
It's a huge danger. And there's also a compensatory advantage in a blockchain approach. Right now, serious journalism is in trouble because it's hard to figure out a revenue stream. Everybody expects that whatever is on the internet should be free. And what's more, if you put something on the internet, you can say it's copyrighted, but that doesn't prevent people from copying it. In a blockchain world, you can stamp it so that it is forever noted as your own work. That's nice. But what's even more important, I think, for newspapers or for sites like our own, is if everyone controls his own identity and if everyone is secure in that control, you can do something like, say, if you want to read this essay, it's going to cost you a penny. And nobody really is going to balk at paying a penny. But if 1,000 people pay a penny, then you have some income from that essay, which you didn't have before. And if you're a major newspaper and you have thousands of people contributing a penny, there's your revenue stream. So I think that's a hugely promising development.
So, Dad, what's your next pick?
Okay. I'm going to go to a much lighter, smaller book, Jesus and the Jewish Roots of Mary by Brant Peter. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing his name right, but it's Pitre. He's done a series of books. This one is subtitled "Unveiling the Mother of the Messiah," and his stock in trade, because he's an expert. He's a biblical scholar, but he's an expert in the intertestamental period and the writings, Jewish writings, particularly from a period of maybe 100 or so years before the birth of Christ through the first couple hundred years after the birth of Christ, so that he is extraordinarily gifted and knowledgeable at learning how the Jews themselves in the period around the time of Christ understood themes and persons that are hinted at in sacred scripture because of all the ancillary commentary that they wrote. And for Mary, what he's able to do is, well, I'll suggest what he does as a juxtaposition. He was turned away a bit from devotion to Mary as Mother of God because of a Protestant father, I think, of his fiancée, criticizing him for his interest in the Queen of Heaven, which in the book of Jeremiah is cited, as a form of worship of the Queen of Heaven, is a form of idolatry. It was a specific idolatrous practice. Of course, it had nothing to do with Our Lady. But he then later learned a lot more about Jewish thought, about the Davidic king and that line and the future Messiah and the position of the Queen Mother. And he uses this thought to give a very clear idea of how the early Christians who converted, obviously from Judaism, conceived of Mary, understood Mary, her identity, her role in salvation history, and so on, based on this exegesis that was done in the larger Jewish community before it was fulfilled, so to speak. And so it's just fascinating to see how the early Christians would have therefore taken their Jewish background and applied it to Mary, and the richness they would have gotten out of that as compared to maybe the way we think about her today, especially in the light of Protestant Catholic polemic. So it's a fascinating book. It's not a long book. None of his books are, but it's legitimate scholarship presented in a very engaging way, which anybody can benefit from, either for study or for spiritual reading.
Okay, so I'm going to run through my next three picks quickly because I want to keep things moving here. The first, there's a friend of mine named Mark Christopher Brandt, and he was on last year's list with both an album and a book. He's a pianist and composer, and he's also on this year's list with both an album and a book. So last year, his spiritual director told him to publish these meditations on the Rosary for use in front of the Blessed Sacrament, and also told him, and that was published late last year, and then this year told him to publish these Stations of the Cross meditations. So right before Lent this year, these came out. It's titled "His Footsteps, Your Calvary," it's a great set of meditations. There's actually several sets, and 2 of them are for use with children. They're really great, and they're very simple and childlike, and they're beneficial for adults as well. But they're really good as a way, and he offers advice on how to introduce your children to these stations, but I'll also allow them to engage in them on their own. One of the great things that he brings that is very relevant to our time in these meditations is an antidote to our culture of being outraged or being upset about things and feeling like we're accomplishing something by just reading something and getting upset. And the Stations of the Cross offer a great way of spiritualizing our sorrow and referring everything to the sorrow caused to Jesus and the suffering caused to Jesus by the sins of the world and our own sins. So that's something that he talks about explicitly in those meditations, specifically one of the meditations he gives for the women of Jerusalem weeping over Jesus, that he touches on that in that meditation. And it's a very timely thought, I think. The next one is John Henry Newman's The Idea of a University. And I did a whole podcast episode on this recently with a Newman scholar, so I won't talk about it that much. It's his classical work on the value and purpose of a liberal education. And there's many great things in there, ideas which I was already familiar with from other sources. But what was new to me and what really stuck with me was and what I'm sure I'll be referring back to for a long time, and meditating on, was his discussion of the distinction between a Christian and a gentleman. And he basically says a liberal education forms a gentleman, and it doesn't in itself necessarily form a Christian. And he talks about some of the difference between the intellectual virtues and social virtues, which are prized by sort of the spirit of education or the spirit of philosophy in a sort of a civilized age, which are not necessarily the deepest virtues for a Christian. So, for example, he talks about the difference between modesty and humility, and he talks about how the gentleman prizes modesty, and his moral sense, he has more of a sense of feeling like he's done a disservice to himself when he does something wrong, rather than feeling guilt before God. So he talks about there's guilt and there's shame. And shame is the sense of having done something that's untoward and inconsistent with one's own nature and the dignity due to oneself. Whereas guilt is the sense of, or fear, as he puts it, is the sense that you've broken a law and offended and are accountable to a lawgiver. And that this, to the gentleman, seems like a servile thing which is unworthy of him. So it's like he reduces the moral law to a sort of aesthetic. And there's a lot more that he talks about in that regard, but I thought it really helped me to put together some things that I was seeing in the intellectual class. And you see it with many Catholic intellectuals as well, who have sort of allowed their education perhaps to get the better of their Catholicism. And then the third is I am halfway through Robert Fagel's translation of Homer's Odyssey, and I just finished his translation of the Iliad. And those are just great, especially his translation of the Iliad. It's very vivid. It's almost like watching an action movie in parts. He just really brings it to life. And his translation of the Odyssey is excellent too. And I'm just finding myself very much relating to the character of Odysseus and the things he values, sort of the cunning, the craftiness and resourcefulness, but ultimately his value of domestic bliss over adventure on the high seas. So I've been really enjoying rereading those in this translation that I hadn't read before. So Phil, what about your next pick?
Right. This may have to be my last one because I'm running out of time here, but this is a bit more what our readers might expect. The Fourth Cup by Scott Hahn, which is a discussion of his research into the meaning of our Lord's Passion when he pointedly does not have the fourth cup at the Last Supper, which would be typical of a Seder meal, the fourth cup of wine. And Scott Hahn, in his introduction to the book, says it's a little bit of a mystery story. You can read it as a mystery story. Well, if you've read his previous books, The Lamb's Feast and Rome Sweet Home, it's not quite so much of a mystery because you know how it ends. But it is fascinating how Hahn goes into the biblical scholarship, which he took very, very seriously as a Protestant minister and scholar and teacher, and how when he went into this scholarship, it pointed him to the Mass. And of course, from there, pointed him towards Catholicism, and was the reason for his conversion. It's a great story. And even though I had, as I say, I knew the story from having read his previous books, I thoroughly enjoyed reading it again.
Well, since you're short on time, why don't you go ahead and just give us your next pick?
Oh, well, the last pick was going to be another one with a personal reason for it, and that is To Change the Church by Ross Douthat. I confess that I was nervous about this book because I had my own book, The Lost Shepherd, coming out, and I knew that Douthat was working on a book about Pope Francis, and I was worried how much competition he would give me. And when it came out, of course, I read it with great interest. It's a good book. It's not a competitor in the sense that we're saying different things. Douthat makes the argument that Pope Francis is rolling the dice in a way. That's unfair. He wouldn't put it pejoratively. That Pope Francis is determined to change the way the world of the church works, her mission of evangelization, that he's trying to do something entirely different, and that he's willing to change things very abruptly, all in the service of this evangelical mission, which he thinks will be better served. I have to say, I'm not persuaded by that argument. I think that I don't see a consistent effort by Pope Francis to do what Douthat claims that he's doing, but I may be wrong, and it's an interesting read while he makes the argument.
Well, Phil, thank you for coming on. I'll let you go, and we'll continue without you, but thanks for your time.
Okay, thank you.
Merry Christmas.
You too.
All right, Dad?
Yeah, I think I'll do two relatively quickly here. The first one I want to emphasize is Timothy O'Donnell's Heart of the Redeemer. There's a second edition out at the very end of 2017. It is by far the best book on the Sacred Heart of Jesus. It covers the dogmatic foundations and the history of the devotion, the visions of St. Margaret and Mary Alacoque, the relevant magisterial statements, and the more recent contributions of the Second Vatican Council, and the insights of Pope St. Paul VI, Pope St. John Paul II, Pope Benedict, and Pope Francis. And the final chapter explores the universal relevance of devotion to the Sacred Heart. I have a special affection for this book, not only because it's so good, I'm happy to see it be brought up to date, but Trinity Communications was the initial publisher of the first edition of this book back in the late 80s, when we were publishing print media before we were forced by economics to stop doing that. So hearty recommendation of Heart of the Redeemer by the current president of Christendom College, Timothy O'Donnell. And then perhaps I should treat equally quickly a much more complex and difficult book by Gerard Verschuren, Verschuren, called Aquinas and Modern Science, A New Synthesis of Faith and Reason. Verschuren uses Aquinas' philosophy to shed light on the nature and proper role in the universe of knowledge of a variety of modern disciplines, including cosmology, physics, genetics, evolutionary biology, neuroscience, and the social sciences. And it's a real contribution to one of the things that Newman was trying to accomplish, as you mentioned, in the idea of a university, showing how things fit together, and how if each branch of knowledge understands its own principles and its own methods and its own ends and its own limitations, it can contribute to a harmonious whole. And if that doesn't happen if all the different disciplines are not informed by what he would call a proper epistemology, or a proper understanding of how we know, which he finds in Aquinas, then it's very difficult for the people in the world, to have a cohesive view of reality that actually makes sense. So I recommend that.
Okay, great. So I'll go ahead and do my last two books here. The first, well, it's technically three, I suppose. The first are two short books of essays by Jacques Maritain. The first is called Art and Poetry, and that has some essays on various painters by him. It has a nice little piece called Dialogues, where he covers some of the same ground that he does in his work, The Responsibility of the Artist, and dialogues with the sort of almost immoralist trends in art of his day, in literature of his day, specifically this thing coming from the followers of Oscar Wilde, that you have to experience everything basically in order to make your art authentic. You have to experience all kinds of evil, where it almost this attempt to make all experience, no matter how depraved, into innocent by refusing to make any judgment of it. And then at the end of that, he has his only essay on music that I know of, which is called The Freedom of Song, which I won't comment on that much here because I've only read it once, and I feel like I needed to read it again before I really understand it. But it was quite interesting to see his thoughts on music drawn out more explicitly than he had anywhere else. The second collection is called The Situation of Poetry, and this actually consists of two essays by his wife, Raissa Maritain, and two by him. And they cover much the same subject matter. They're on poetry, magic, which is not used in the occult sense. It's kind of hard to get into what they mean by that in an artistic context. And basically the nature of poetic knowledge and its similarity to and distinction from mystical knowledge. So if you want to get into whether poetic knowledge is the same as mystical knowledge or not, and why, that is the collection to read. I haven't finished it yet, but that's also very good. These are not really the greatest places to start with Maritain's philosophy of art, because they only offer little bites and they don't give you the full context of what he's talking about. Some of the essays were published in periodicals of the day and require sort of a cultural context that you wouldn't know just jumping into them from scratch. But very good pieces nonetheless. I'm looking forward to revisiting them at some point. For those who want to look into Maritain or at least his philosophy of art, I would recommend starting with either Art and Scholasticism, or even more so, the most accessible is The Responsibility of the Artist.
Speaking of collections, I have a collection of essays that I would like to talk about a little bit too, if you're ready for that.
Sure.
Okay. I think Father George William Rutler, who's a priest up your way in the Archdiocese of New York, is very likely to be the English-speaking world's premier living Catholic essayist. He is extraordinarily well educated. He has a mind that retains all kinds of interesting facts about and anecdotes about history and about life. And he has impressively sound Catholic judgment. He writes regularly for Crisis magazine, which is all online. And he also speaks regularly. And from time to time, his essays and speeches get kind of revised and plunked into a collection. And his latest collection is, which is just out, is Calm in Chaos, which is a really great topic for a period of time when the condition of the church is so agonizingly poor, so that we Catholics can become discouraged. And between Father Rutler's ability to make sound points and his delightful storytelling and wonderful sense of humor, he writes a whole series of essays in this collection, mostly from 2015 and 2016, which are just enormously pleasurable to read. Sometimes will have you laughing out loud because of his wit, but always end in a sound and, I would say, in accordance with the title, calming spiritual judgment in the midst of our current chaos.
So my last book is the collected plays and writings on theater of Karol Wojtyła, also known as John Paul II, edited and translated by Boleslav Taborski. I'm not going to talk about this too much because I'm doing an episode on Wojtyła's artistic output soon that should come out early next year. But it was a great experience reading through these plays. Often when I read John Paul II's writings, I feel like it's so relevant to me personally. I feel like he's speaking directly to me. That said, I'm not going to talk much more about this for now because I'm actually planning to do an episode on this sometime in January probably, or early next year anyway. Okay, so that's it for our discussion. Again, you can see the whole list at catholicculture.org/episode 25. For today's reading, I'm just going to keep it light. I was browsing around a cool bookstore in Manhattan called Argosy Bookstore earlier this afternoon, and I came across two different memoirs by Sir Alec Guinness, who you probably know as having played Obi-Wan Kenobi in the original Star Wars trilogy. Now, Sir Alec was actually a Catholic convert. I forget if he was a convert or a revert, but the story I remember hearing is that he had played Father Brown in a BBC series, Father Brown being the character created by G.K. Chesterton, who goes around solving crimes. And at one point after shooting, he was walking through town still in his costume, his clerics, and this little child came up to him and just trustingly put his hand in Sir Alec's hand and walked alongside him. And Sir Alec was so moved by that complete trust that this child had in him because he was a priest that he started reconsidering Catholicism. So I was flipping through the second of his three memoirs. This one is titled My Name Escapes Me, The Diary of a Retiring Actor. And I came across this fun little quote where he's talking about the subpar translations of scripture found in the post-Vatican II vernacular liturgy. Here's Sir Alec. The raising of Lazarus from the dead is the subject of today's gospel. The current sub-supermarket translation has Christ asking, "Where have you put him?" as if Lazarus might be a basket, and later, "Lazarus, here! Come out!" as if calling a terrier digging in a rabbit warren. Thank you for listening, and I will link to our article containing all these selections and links to them at catholicculture.org/episode 25. And that is the last episode for this year. So have a wonderful rest of your Advent, Merry Christmas, and Happy New Year's. And thank you for listening. Thank you, Dad, for coming on and talking about this stuff with us.
Yeah, you're welcome. My pleasure.